Linkin Park. Let's talk about them. So Linkin Park was one of my favorite bands growing up. I was getting into rock music around the same time I was 14 years old, and among many other bands, Linkin Park was definitely one of the very first few that I remember casually listening to a lot. In fact, around the same time I started to listen to albums, Linkin Park was pretty much when it all started. I could even say that it was the band that I listened to the most at some point in my life. So what I'm trying to say here is, this is a band that I know front to back. And I think it's finally time that I get to talk about them. I mean, I did talk about them in a video before, but I'm talking about a video dedicated to the band primarily. Today I'm going to be ranking all of the 7 studio albums from the band, from Hybrid Theory all the way up to One More Light. So hey, let's just go ahead and start.
You say that I'm paranoid.
One More Light is kind of a hard album to talk about, honestly, and that's mainly because of everything surrounding the album upon release. So let me put it like this, the band by early 2017 had already defined themselves in pop culture. I mean, they've been popular and culturally relevant since the very start, and by that point they've already released 6 studio albums. However, they've also been no stranger to a lot of backlash as well. Not just during the new metal days because, well, the genre itself was very hated in general, but also especially on later albums when they will try to depart from their new metal sound. They got a lot of backlash because people who like their new metal sound just weren't really on board with what the band will do afterwards. However, the most hate the band ever got during their whole career was on their final album One More Light. 2017 was really not a good year for Linkin Park fans, and I'm not just talking about the album, but that was also the year when the lead member of the band, Chester Bennington, took his life away, which to say the least was a very tragic event. It also happened like 2 months right after the album's release. So in a way I do feel pretty bad to be negative towards the album, but I cannot lie to myself, I still find this album to be really bad. To get this out of the way, I don't think this is necessarily a sellout record, like a lot of people were accusing the band for at the time. The band has always been in a way passionate about pop music. I mean, Chester did do a live cover of Rolling in the Deep in the early 2010s, and throughout their whole career they've always had pop hooks across their songs and were generally a pretty accessible band. And to give this album some credit at the very least, the lyrics of the album are definitely not bad. I even appreciate a lot of the emotion in a lot of these songs, especially with the title track, which, yeah, is definitely the best song here. Although I will still not rank it among some of their best songs in general, but you know. That's where all of my compliments end. This album on a instrumental level just doesn't work for me at all. The problem with One More Light is simply that it's very forgettable and bland, even occasionally obnoxious. I will be willing to believe that the band did generally have the intentions of making a 2010s mainstream pop album, but intentions can only get you so far when the execution doesn't really live up to it. When the sound of your album is still very generic and basic, and that's certainly the case here. I mean, the album just fails to stand out, and it's just mostly filled with these bad electropop stereotypes and cliches that, well, you're already seeing in like, I don't know, an Ed Sheeran or a Chainsmokers album. Like, the album is just not unique. I mean, it's definitely not the worst pop album that I've ever heard. There are certainly some pop albums out there that are more, well, embarrassing. But this is a direction that definitely didn't really suit the band in any way. I mean, one of the most appealing things about Linkin Park to me was that whenever they will approach a genre, they will usually put their own unique spin to it that I will usually find very fascinating and, well, interesting. Like, I don't think you will confuse Linkin Park with any other band out there, and that is just not the case here. It's just very generic, run-of-the-mill 2010s pop music, and easily the least inventive album that the band has ever released. Still though, I wish things didn't end the way they did. That still fucks me up, honestly. So despite this being the second worst album on the ranking, I think there is definitely a significant difference of quality between this and One More Light. One More Light was, well, a pretty bad and misguided record, but Living Things on the other hand is actually okay. it's fine. Living Things was, in a way, the band's return to a more commercial sound. It retained a lot of the electronic quirks of the album before it, 1000 Songs, but the songs were generally a lot more traditional than poppy, and yeah, the result, like I said before, was actually alright. There are some songs here that I do really like. Lost in the Echo is a pretty good way to start the album, even though, well, the bridge kinda sucks. I'll Be Gone is a really catchy song despite the, well, really dark lyrics. Castle of Glass is really good. Powerless is a solid closer, and I do really like the lead single from the album, Burn It Down. Yeah, this was always a song that I found myself putting on a lot. It's just a really good pop song that really does blend the heavy electronic instrumentation with the band's poppier songwriting abilities, well, pretty well. But despite there being some good songs, Living Things I still think is one of the more forgettable Linkin Park albums. And that's mainly because I feel like the band is just sorta playing it a little bit too safe here. Their approach at making these electronic fused rock songs still work, but I can't help to shake the feeling that a lot of it still feels like, well, leftovers from 1000 Songs. Like even when it comes to the worst habits from that album, where you have songs where
I wanna see you choke and lie. Swallow up your grace. Suffer alone in the misery.
I don't even know what the band is even doing. And yeah, I think this is also the album that I think suffers the most when it comes to pacing and song transitions. Like when it comes to the album as a cohesive experience, it feels kind of sloppy. Like you go from Burn It Down to, well, a weird song like Lies Create Misery, which doesn't flow that well, and then you suddenly return to a generally poppier and more traditional song with I'll Be Gone. The second half of the album especially suffers from that problem. None of the problems that I mentioned are necessarily major. I feel like the album still manages to be slightly more enjoyable than, well, it's not, making it, like I said before, an okay record. It's just one that I usually don't really tend to think about often. Like out of all of the Linkin Park albums, this one gives the impression of, oh yeah, another Linkin Park album, more than any other album from them. But hey, it's not a bad album still.
Token, look away to the right. More. More. Why the hell would I be looking way over there?
Minutes to Midnight. This is kind of an interesting album to talk about, mainly because of what it represents in the band's discography and in their progression as a band. Considering the band started out as a new metal act during the first two albums, Minutes to Midnight was ultimately the first departure that the band has ever made, shifting more into alternative rock, ballads, and taking a lot of pages from U2's style of writing because, I don't know, I guess Chester was going through the same thing that I was, well, earlier this year. Curse you, Bono. It also kind of shares a similar situation as One More Light. At the time when the album came out, a lot of people were mad at the direction that Linkin Park was heading into. They didn't like the softer approach of Minutes to Midnight, and some even called them sellouts because of that. However, I think there are two differences. One, Minutes to Midnight was actually very commercially successful. The lead single, What I've Done, became one of their most popular songs. And yeah, actually pretty much every single did manage to crack within the Billboard Hot 100. Something not even the first two albums managed to accomplish. And the other difference is that I think this album is definitely a lot better than One More Light. Is it a good album? I wouldn't really go there yet. But there's a lot of it that I do appreciate. First of all, despite the softer approach of the album on an instrumental level, this is lyrically wise the darkest Linkin Park album. In contrast to the first two albums that were generally more anger fueled, a lot of Minutes to Midnight has a certain defeated nature to it that feels very haunting. The song Leave Out All the Rest, for example, I think is just generally a very vulnerable song, talking about loss and what you're going to be remembered for when you eventually die. Again, considering Chester's death 10 years later, the lyrics of the song are pretty heartbreaking to look back on in retrospective. And this is also one of my favorite songs from the album as well, not just because of the haunting lyrics, but I just generally love the atmospheric, somber, and kind of spacey instrumentation of the song. It really does reflect the lyrics when it comes to how fragile it sounds. Yeah, honestly, I do love this song. I also really like Shot of the Day, a clearly very U2 inspired song that is also better than, well, any song that U2 has made during the 2000s, let's be honest messier. The little things give you away, it took a while to grow on me, but it's generally just a very compelling closer. And then you have In Pieces, which is actually my favorite song from the album. I mean, amazing instrumentation, amazing vocals from Chester, a pretty remarkable guitar solo, great lyrics as well. I don't have much to say about it per se, but it's just one of those songs that just comes together so well for me. But yeah, the best thing about the album for me has always been the sentiment through it all. It's Chester at his most vulnerable and raw. And you know what? I like that about it. Like even on the angriest song on the album, Giving Up, feels far more raw than anything on the first two albums. But there's still a reason why this album is still kind of low on my list. For the amount of things that I like about it, there's also a lot of things that I really don't like about it. One of the singles from the album that I really don't like is Bleed It Out. I've always found this song to be one of their most obnoxious and repetitive songs. The chorus is clunky, both Chester and Mike are clunky. Like I never really understood what was the vision that the band had for the song, because quite frankly I don't really understand it. Valentine's Day is a song that I find to be really corny. Yeah, the album has a lot of corny moments throughout from start to finish, but most of the time I'm actually fine with its corniness. This however, well, isn't the case. No More Sorrow is a song that I never really got its appeal. A lot of Linkin Park fans like this one, but honestly I always got the impression that they only liked it because it was, well, simply heavy and angry. Because otherwise I think this is one of Chester's worst performances, and the whole song just comes off as a forced attempt at a political song. Which, speaking of which, Hands Held High. This song it's really bad. In fact, this is probably my least favorite Linkin Park song. Like, I will actually take any song from One More Light over it. It's this really boring and lame ballad of a song with some of the dumbest lyrics, especially with that part. And Mike Shinoda's performance isn't necessarily unlistenable here, but it just invokes nothing out of me. The song sucks. So yeah, overall, I think this album has always been sort of a mixed bag to me. It definitely has plenty of great moments and some great songs even, but it's still the most inconsistent album in their discography for me. Well, this is going to be a fascinating one to talk about. After the commercial success of Minutes to Midnight, Linkin Park's follow-up to it was going to be even more different than the first two albums. Not only taking a lot of the elements from Minutes to Midnight, but expanding on them even further as well, heading into a more conceptual and experimental route. And from that came 1,000 Suns, released in September of 2010. This album was controversial to say the least. In fact, more than any other Linkin Park album, this is easily the band's most divisive record. A lot of people really like it and consider it to be one of the band's best albums, but a lot of other people, well, feel about the opposite way. And I personally actually quite like it, to be honest. Do I think it's amazing? Oh, definitely not. I think this album is very flawed, but it's still one that I usually tend to defend. I think it's a good album. Okay, let's start this time with what I don't like about the album. Let's start with my main problem, and that being the overuse of interludes. I mean, I get why there are interludes in the album, considering, well, the album's main vision, but I think there's just too many of them. I think some of them work, like the first two interludes of the album, for example, do properly immerse you to the sound and the themes of the record well, but there's also an interlude like Wisdom, Justice and Love, which only really feels like it's being added to pad out the album to a longer runtime. And some of these interludes I don't think should have been necessarily separate tracks as well. Like I've talked about the first two tracks of the album in a positive light, but they really should have been just one track. Like I don't know why they're separate, it doesn't really make any sense to me. And that's not the only example. I mean, you also have Empty Spaces, which could have been simply a part of When They Come For Me, but instead it's just a separate track for some reason. I know this might sound like a very minor thing, but it always bothers me, I just can't help it. But even outside of that, I mean, there's a few songs here that I really don't like. Red and Kings is the one that sticks out the most to me in that I don't know what the fuck the band was thinking with this one. This song just sounds utterly broken to me, like everything about it just feels very ugly and messy and not really in the good way either. It just kind of feels like a compilation of all of the worst qualities from the album to me. Yeah, this song is pretty bad. I also don't really like the closer, The Messenger. I get what the band was visioning with this song, like, you know, a calm after the storm to finish off the album, but the execution doesn't really, well, it doesn't work. And that's mainly because Chester's singing sticks out like a sore thumb. Like his singing doesn't contrast with the soft instrumentation in any way, and it just more so feels, well, distracting. That said though, despite all of the flaws of the album, when the album is good, it's really, really good. Like some of the best songs on Linkin Park's entire discography. especially. You have Burning in the Skies, which is one of the prettiest and most majestic songs that the band has ever done. Like, I always get warm, melancholic feels whenever I hear this song, especially with that wonderful synth solo. It's so good. Waiting for the End is also amazing. A lot of people tend to commonly refer to it as the best song of the album, and it's not hard to see why. You can tell the band was really inspired making it, not only because of the emotional punch of the song. Like, I've always found it to be very uplifting, and the lyrics do resonate with me a lot. I especially love this line.
The hardest part of ending is starting again.
But it's just one of the most stunning songs that the band has done, period. They implement their electronic influences perfectly here. And the Catalyst is also another one worth mentioning. It's pretty much the climax of the album, and it absolutely delivers on every front. So yeah, I think what I admire about 1000 Songs is just how much of a passionate project it feels. Obviously, the album does end up heading into some juvenile or even questionable directions. Ahem. But this does in a way feel like the most inspired Linkin Park album. Underneath the more unconventional than electronic sound, there's a certain humanity to it that, well, makes it very compelling. Like, it's far from a perfect album, but it's certainly a very interesting project regardless. So I remember listening to this album for the first time and being so caught off guard by the beginning of the first song. I can't believe Linkin Park can scare me. Anyways, The Haunting Party. So, do you remember how One More Light was Linkin Park's attempt at a full-on pop album? Well, this album was going to be pretty much the opposite case, in that The Haunting Party was going to be, in a way, a bit of a return to the earlier sound of the band. In that the album will be dropping off the electronic elements of 1000 Songs and Living Things in favor for, well, a full-on straight rock album. Not necessarily the same as Hybrid Theory or Meteora. I will more so describe it as a rock album in an even more traditional sense. That's also very raw and straightforward. A reaction to the more safe-sounding rock bands of the 2010s. And I have to say, it's actually quite good. The album straight off the gate just starts really strong with the first 3 songs. It starts with Keys of the Kingdom, which is a song where you immediately get the impression of what the album is going to be centered on. It's going to be heavy, it's going to be loud, it's not going to hold your hand for the rest of the experience, and I like that for it. I think my favorite part of the song is just how intense and unnerving Chester sounds on it. Like, it almost sounds like a different vocalist. And the chorus is extremely loud too, like it's literally what the song starts with, and every time it comes back, well, it's just as intense as ever. All for Nothing and Guilty All the Same are also great. They carry the kind of accelerating energy that the first song sets you off on, while also having particularly really catchy and memorable choruses as well. And even outside of those 3, I mean, there's Wastelands, there's Rebellion, which is probably the most System of a Down-esque kind of song here. There's Mark the Grace, which is a song that I actually used to not like, because, well, it was unconventional, then I guess my teenager brain at the time couldn't comprehend it, but it's a really compelling piece of the album. I guess you could say it's Linkin Park's most, I don't know, post-rock song. And oh, of course, there's A Line in the Sand, which is both the closer of the album and the best song on the album. Like, talk about a great closing song. It feels like the culmination of everything great you come across on the album. It has a lot of hard-hitting and powerful riffs, it feels grand and epic, it builds up an exciting and satisfying climax towards the end, it keeps the intensity that we've seen throughout the album. It's just a great closing track. Possibly their best song, I have to think about that. And I mean, yeah, I feel like when it comes to the album's attempt at being, well, a purely rock album in every sense, you know, I think it truly does succeed at it. And it doesn't really sacrifice the appeal of the band's first 2 albums as well. There's still a lot of catchy and memorable hooks in here, there's still a lot of angst that people love from the band, and it just feels like a very well-rounded album, like it's probably their most consistent. That said though, there's one thing that I don't like about the album that much, and that's the production. Sure, the songs do feel heavy and even big in a sense, but I don't know, I feel like the songs at the same time feel very rough and drawn out, especially with the drums. I know that that was the intention if you look at the behind the scenes and production history of the album, but I always felt like it could have been pulled off better. I'm also not a big fan of the song Until It's Gone. A lot of Linkin Park fans like this one, but I always thought it was the most dull song on the album. I mean, it's not terrible, just one that I don't really listen to. But overall, I do really like this album. Well, now we finally reached the first two albums. The two albums that made Linkin Park a household name in pop culture and the ones that people tend to remember the band for the most. So hey, let's talk about them. Meteora, as you probably have already known, was in a way a sequel to Hybrid Theory. Hybrid Theory was a gigantic commercial success. So big as a matter of fact that it became the best selling new metal album of all time. I mean, it was diamond certified, the singles did really well, especially in the end. It was a really successful album, so yeah, in a way it made sense for the follow-up Meteora to have, well, a similar sound. And I think they were able to do a proper follow-up because, well, Meteora was a really good album. I mean, it really was. Nearly everything that people like about Hybrid Theory, myself included, was pretty much present here. To me, one of the best aspects of Hybrid Theory was how much of a unique album it was, especially in the new metal sphere. It mainly stood out because the rest of the bands weren't really doing this unique blend of industrial, electronic and pop rock. It had catchy and memorable melodies, it had very dynamic production choices, it had the angst that didn't feel like it was forcing it down your throat, and Chester and Mike were giving performances that didn't really sound like anything else in the genre. So going back to Meteora, you can tell that the band was able to translate nearly all of those qualities for the follow-up album, and in some ways it even felt like an evolution. Let's start with the singles. Other than From the Inside, which is a song that I never really cared for, to be honest. In fact, I still don't know why the band chose this song over some others that would have been better choices for a single. The singles from the album are really memorable. Somewhere I Belong is great. Fame is probably the Linkin Park song that I enjoy listening to the most, purely on a rhythmic level. Like, that string loop is just so fucking good, man. It's so fucking good. Numb is chilling and exceptionally written, and Breaking the Habit is still my favorite song from the album. Just like I mentioned it on my new metal video, I mean, the song has a strong melodic atmosphere to it, and the lyrics are some of the band's best, like they still resonate with me. What I find fascinating about the song is that it's actually pretty different from the sound of the first two albums, yet at the same time does manage to retain that Linkin Park style and edge to it. Yeah, it's a classic, great music video as well. And even outside of those two songs, I mean, you have Don't Stay, Lying From You, Session, which is honestly a pretty underrated song in their catalog, yeah, there you go. In fact, the instrumental songs from their discography should be talked about more honestly because, I mean, they're pretty great. But yeah, Meteora is just a solid album front to back. There's a few times when the album does feel like it's trading ground from Hybrid Theory a little bit too much. Like Easier to Run is literally just crawling but far more melodic and soft, or Hit the Floor kind of feels like a filler addition to the record, or like I said before, From the Inside is kind of forgettable. But for the most part, Meteora is a really good album. However, I think their debut album is even better. I guess I'll try to spend less time here because I already end up talking a fair bit about the album during the Meteora section, but I still think this is the best Linkin Park album. Not only it being the album that immediately brought them into the mainstream, but you can already tell they had already a well-defined and unique sound since the very start. I also think this is the more consistent album of the first two. While Meteora might have had about 2 or 3 songs I didn't really care for that much, every song on this album on the other hand goes pretty hard. Well, actually, not necessarily. Crawling is not a very good song, but even that one is memorable. I don't know, Crawling is just too funny to hate for me. But yeah, Hybrid Theory is the band's defining album to me. In some ways, it was an album that came at the right time. It was very accessible and catchy, but it also had a very powerful emotional angst that, unlike many other acts from this genre, actually felt real and passionate. It was an album that not only appealed to people who like new metal, but it also appealed to people who were generally rock fans in general. They crafted such a unique and singular identity here that it's not hard to see why they will eventually become popular for it. I might be a little biased here because this is the first album that I, well, ever heard in my life. Fun fact if you didn't actually know about that. But even though I wouldn't really consider this to be one of my favorite albums of all time anymore, I can perfectly understand why I became so engaged with it. Paper Cut, With You, In the End, A Place for My Head, Pushing Me Away, fucking Points of Authority, motherfucking Points of Authority. Many of the songs were thoughtful, were emotionally engaging, and even purely on a surface level, I mean, they were just fun to listen to. Even some of the cornier songs like One Step Closer, I still find myself quoting from time to time. So yeah, I still think this album is pretty great. It's one of the major albums that got me more interested in music, and it's certainly one that has meant a lot to me.